It is never good news to hear that nuclear weapons are in the news, but we are in a moment where we are getting just that on multiple fronts. The most prominent story comes out of Ukraine, with discussions on how Kyiv might enforce a ceasefire if it doubts the West's commitment to be involved in a peace plan. However, there is a second thread not receiving as much attention: the possibility of a showdown between the United States and Iran over the latter's nuclear weapons program. I wanted to get a fresh perspective on these issues, so I recently sat down with Matt Fuhrmann, a political science professor at Texas A&M, to discuss how states handle nuclear proliferation problems. Matt has written extensively on coercion with nuclear weapons, the construction of nuclear weapons, and preventive wars to destroy nuclear weapons programs. His most recent book, Influence Without Arms: The New Logic of Nuclear Deterrence, explores how states use the ability to produce nuclear weapons as leverage over their political rivals. I began by asking him about Ukraine's current ability to produce a bomb. Why don't you start off by giving us a broad overview of where Ukraine is along the spectrum of nuclear weapons production?
So the first thing to point out is that nuclear technology is dual use in nature, which means it has both civilian or military applications. It can be used to produce electricity at nuclear power plants or to potentially make fissile material for nuclear bombs. Ukraine has a civilian nuclear energy program, which, because of the dual use nature of the technology, could be used potentially as a foundation for a nuclear weapons program. Importantly, however, Ukraine does not possess the most sensitive kinds of technology, which are uranium enrichment plants or plutonium reprocessing facilities. These are considered the most sensitive because they could provide countries with the means to make fissile material for a nuclear weapon, and obtaining fissile material for a nuclear weapon is widely considered to be the most difficult step in making a bomb. So to make a nuclear weapon, Ukraine or any other country would need to be able to produce fissile material. And presently, as far as we know, Ukraine lacks the facilities that would be needed to produce this. So if Ukraine were to launch a nuclear weapons program, it would be starting from a very low threshold.
Okay, I understand that we are going to have to shift to a highly speculative framework for my next question, and that's a little bit strange from a political science perspective, but let's go with it for a second. Imagine that Ukraine would not have to worry about any outside interference from the United States or Russia, so discount the possibility of economic coercion or military coercion for a moment. What do you think Ukraine's fastest timeline to a nuclear weapon would be if it initiated a crash program where it's trying to go as fast as possible?
It's an important question, but also one that's difficult to answer. I'm going to assume that Ukraine, because it would be worried about the prospect of Russia detecting its activities, would value secrecy and therefore would want to build facilities that were buried deep underground and would want to involve a very small team of scientists in the project. So that's going to affect the timelines that I tell you about. To make a nuclear weapon, there are three main steps that have to be accomplished. The first is to obtain the fissile material, and we've talked a little bit about that. The second is to weaponize that material, and the third is to make the weapon to a delivery system like a missile. Because the fissile material part of things is widely considered to be the most difficult, I'm going to focus on that for a minute. So again, let's remember Ukraine does not have any enrichment or reprocessing facilities, so it would have to build one of these from scratch in order to make plutonium or weapons-grade highly enriched uranium for a bomb. Let's look at the two options to make fissile material. First, there's the plutonium path, and second, there's the highly enriched uranium path. For the plutonium path, you need two main things. You need a reactor that can produce plutonium and spent nuclear fuel, and you also need a reprocessing plant that can separate the plutonium from the other byproducts produced in nuclear waste. Ukraine has the reactors that it could potentially use, but it lacks a reprocessing facility to make the plutonium. According to US government analyses in the late 1970s, a country could develop a reprocessing plant in a very crude way in about 1 year of effort. So if we assume Ukraine was going to embark on the plutonium path, and we assume it was willing to use plutonium from its civilian reactors, it could potentially have plutonium for a bomb in a year's time. But this would require Ukraine to break international treaty commitments because all of its civilian plants are subjected to safeguards from the International Atomic Energy Agency. These are inspected plants as well. So the probability that some kind of diversion of material, were it to occur, would be detected is pretty high. So I don't think the plutonium route would be all that attractive for Ukraine, even though the timeline is relatively shorter compared to the uranium path.
All right, then what does the uranium path look like instead, and what are the advantages and disadvantages with that?
So for the uranium path, you need to build a facility that can do what's called enrichment of uranium in order to convert it into a form that would be suitable for use in a nuclear weapon. Again, Ukraine presently does not have any facility that's capable of doing this, so it would have to start from scratch. An advantage of the enrichment path is that it would be easier for Ukraine to conceal this facility. It could be relatively small in size, and it could be potentially deep underground. And on top of that, if Ukraine were to hypothetically go on the enrichment path, it wouldn't have to use any existing civilian facilities in order to produce the material. So it wouldn't have to worry about detection as a result of inspections of an existing civilian plants. So for those reasons, this path might be attractive were Ukraine to think about a nuclear weapons option. A downside is that the timeline would be a bit longer. Probably it would take them at least 2 to 3 years to produce a facility that could produce enough weapons-grade highly enriched uranium, which is what you would need for a nuclear weapon. And that's an aggressive timetable. You can think about the Manhattan Project in the United States as providing a potential baseline. The Manhattan Project took about 3 years to produce nuclear weapons, which the United States ultimately dropped on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of World War II. So that gives us some frame of reference for the amount of time that it could take Ukraine to accomplish a similar feat.
If I could jump in for a second here, there's obviously been a lot of time since World War II and the Manhattan Project and today, and a lot of what went into the Manhattan Project was figuring out whether nuclear weapons at all were possible. So how does that influence the timeline here? Because presumably Ukraine is not going to be making the same types of mistakes that the United States did during its progress toward the first nuclear weapon.
In general, things become easier to do the more times it's done and the more time that passes. So you might suppose that a country like Ukraine, 70 plus years into the nuclear age, could be able to build a uranium enrichment plant faster than the United States did during World War II. At the same time, when we look at historical data, we find that a lot of uranium enrichment programs actually took longer over time. For example, Iran started its effort to enrich uranium in the late 1980s, and it wasn't until the mid-2000s when it successfully enriched uranium for the first time. So these programs can take many years, sometimes decades, to succeed. The thing with Ukraine is that it's in a potentially very desperate situation. So if it were to pursue a nuclear weapons program, it would likely be making that the highest national priority and devoting lots of resources and scientists to the program, which we think would accelerate the timeline to some degree.
Okay, so you think that the most likely scenario here would be something along the lines of uranium enrichment, but that's, of course, just to fuel the bomb itself. There's also assembling the bomb and designing the bomb. Any thoughts about that?
Right, so this discussion takes us through the first step, which is producing the fissile material. And again, this is the most difficult step. But Ukraine would still need to overcome the other two steps in the process, which would include weaponizing the highly enriched uranium and then finding some way to deliver this weapon. It's very difficult to assess how long these steps would take. I think if Ukraine were to launch a nuclear weapons program, it would be looking to accomplish weapon design and delivery in as crude a way as possible. If a country wanted to put a nuclear weapon on top of a long-range missile, that's going to require a lot of technical hurdles to be overcome. You have to, for example, miniaturize the weapon so it's small enough to travel long distances on a long-range missile. And this can add potentially years to a country's proliferation timeline. So I'm going to assume that Ukraine would opt for a simpler, cruder method of delivery, maybe in the way that we would think about a terrorist group or a non-state actor thinking about delivery of such a weapon. For example, putting it in a shipping container or some kind of other cargo container, or delivering it in a truck, or something along those lines, because otherwise the timeline for Ukraine getting to a weapon might be too long for it to be politically valuable for the Ukrainians. So putting this all together, we're looking at 2 to 3 years, I think, as a reasonable threshold for the amount of fissile material being produced. And then I would add at least several more months, possibly up to a year, to be able to put something together that could be delivered in a very crude way.
Well, that's very interesting, because if you think about where we are in the war right now, we're more than 3 years in, which means that if someone had suggested to Zelensky at the start of the invasion, and they did indeed go with this, then we're getting to the period right now where we might start seeing a Ukrainian nuclear weapon. And again, I need to emphasize here that this is all pure speculation. There's no evidence that this has happened. But of course, part of the process would be to keep it secret. So, none of us really know. We're probably talking about 1% or lower there. So relatively low chances, at least from my perspective, but still interesting to discuss nonetheless. But continuing on, one of the assumptions that we made a moment ago was that we were going to suppose that Russia would not see this and Russia would not intervene if they did see this. I want to transition now into what would happen if Russia did observe this and decide to take preventive action, what exactly that might look like, given that some of the research that you have done, aside from the current book, has been on strikes to stop countries from developing nuclear weapons.
It's a great question, and it has two parts. The first is, could Russia detect nuclear activities happening in Ukraine, and if so, how? And then the second is, if it did detect these activities, what would it do in response? So let me take both of those questions in turn. Countries have a pretty good track record of identifying covert nuclear activities that are undertaken by their adversaries. But it's not a perfect track record. So you might wonder, how do countries like Russia try and monitor what Ukraine might be up to in this space? And there's several different tools that countries have utilized historically and today as well. One of them is looking at satellite imagery to try and detect any suspicious building that's happening. Another is to monitor electronic communications from within a country like Ukraine to see if there's any chatter about potential nuclear activities that are taking place. And a third method would be to try and recruit human sources on the ground that might be able to tip off the Russians if they detect any evidence of nuclear chatter within a country like Ukraine. Using these different techniques, historically, countries have often been successful in identifying when a rival country is trying to secretly develop a nuclear plant of some kind. For example, in 2007, Israel detected a nuclear reactor that was being built in Syria with assistance from North Korea. And once it detected this reactor, Israel took military action to bomb it and completely destroyed the facility. However, the track record isn't perfect. History shows that sometimes countries have been able to conceal some nuclear activities from the broader international community and from their adversaries. One example of this is Iraq in the 1980s. Iraq, under Saddam Hussein at the time, had a much more expansive nuclear program, which was taken deep underground, than the United States realized at the time of the 1991 Persian Gulf War. During that war, the United States heavily bombed Iraq's nuclear infrastructure, including nuclear facilities about which it knew. But the problem for the United States was that there were several nuclear sites within Iraq that U.S. intelligence didn't know about, and therefore those facilities were not destroyed. It wasn't until after the war that we understood better that Iraq had a much more expansive nuclear program, including sensitive work on uranium enrichment, than was previously known prior to the war. So there is some historical precedent for thinking that under certain conditions, countries might be able to have success in concealing some of their nuclear activities. But I want to emphasize that this can be very difficult to do because intelligence agencies are really adept when they know where to look at detecting potential nuclear activity.
Okay, so let's imagine then that Russia can figure this out and can detect that Ukraine has an ongoing operation, and maybe they even know where it is. What does a preventive action look like in this context, given that we're already in the middle of a war?
We can look to historical examples like during World War II, when the Allies bombed a heavy water production facility that Nazi Germany was attempting to use in Norway, which it occupied at the time. This is the first instance historically when a country has used military force to destroy nuclear infrastructure on the territory of another state. But it certainly wasn't the last time that this was contemplated or even carried out. Fast forward several decades during the Iran-Iraq War, Iraq bombed nuclear infrastructure in Iran that was under development as well. So when you're already fighting an interstate war, there's a much higher probability that if you detect nuclear activity, you would take military action to destroy it. So I have little doubt that in a world where Ukraine embarks on a path to develop a nuclear weapon and Russia detects nuclear activities, that it would attempt to use military action to destroy any relevant facility that it detected.
Well, how exactly would Russia go about doing that? Because presumably Ukraine is not going to be putting these things close to the front line, because that would be ridiculous. You would think that it would be in the western half of the country or as far west as possible. And what we have seen before at the beginning of the war is Russia having the inability to fight a war into that distance inside of Ukraine and be able to stick that. So presumably you're not going to be looking at a ground invasion to take these things over. You're going to be looking at an airstrike of some kind. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Ukraine would know that if it decided to build covert nuclear facilities, that Russia would attempt to destroy those in the event that it detected them. So it would take any measure it could to try and hide relevant nuclear activity from the Russians. And it would also take measures to try and harden relevant facilities so that they were harder to destroy. That means Ukraine would likely do something deep underground, probably several hundred feet underground, to make it harder for airstrikes to destroy relevant facilities or infrastructure. So Russia might have to think about a commando raid of some kind rather than traditional airstrikes to be able to destroy nuclear assets that were buried deep underground.
Okay, that's only been half of the problems, though, for Ukraine internationally toward developing a bomb. You could imagine that there is a scenario where Russia just doesn't think it has the ability to penetrate that far into the country. Even with that, knowing that Ukraine can build a weapon without interference from Russia, there's still the West, and specifically the United States being a country that has a long track record of being against the further proliferation of nuclear weapons. So imagine that the United States or someone else in the West spots this and understands what's happening. What might Russia, or rather, what might Ukraine expect to see in response to that?
It's difficult to know what U.S. nonproliferation policy currently is under the Trump administration. It's true that ever since 1945, most U.S. presidential administrations have opposed the international spread of nuclear weapons and worked to make it more difficult, even for allies, to obtain nuclear weapons. Based on some things that President Trump has said, however, it's unclear whether this policy is going to continue under his second term. For example, he has suggested in the past that maybe it wouldn't be such a bad idea if countries like Japan or South Korea were to build nuclear weapons on their own. So if the U.S. abandons or rolls back its opposition to nuclear proliferation, it might not put up much resistance to a potential Ukrainian nuclear weapons program. And that's a big departure from what we've seen in the past, where, again, even when dealing with a country that's a close ally, the United States has often worked to oppose the ally from developing nuclear weapons. So I think we're in an environment where there's a lot of uncertainty and it's difficult to know what the United States might do. One thing that I think we can say for certain is that if the United States detected hypothetical nuclear activity in Ukraine, it almost certainly would not use military force to destroy facilities the way that Russia might. It would instead think about political pressure or economic pressure that it could apply on Ukraine in order to get it to curtail those nuclear activities.
I think that is an interesting point about having so much uncertainty about what the Trump administration would do, especially thinking about how there's been relatively little response to what we've heard in the news about various murmurs of Poland perhaps being interested in developing a nuclear weapon and not seeing much of a response from the Trump administration there either. Nonetheless, I think I want to pivot now to how your new book fits into this puzzle. The very brief summary of that book is that you show that the ability to produce nuclear weapons, and specifically the possession of enrichment or reprocessing facilities, can bring benefits in international negotiations. Now, again, as far as we know, Ukraine does not have any of these currently. But if they could get there quickly, how do you see this affecting a potential ceasefire?
The first thing I want to say is that there's 3 different ways I identify in the book that countries can potentially gain leverage from having the technological capability to build nuclear weapons, even if they don't presently possess them. I call them deterrence by proliferation, delayed attack, and doubt. Let me just take a minute to briefly unpack how each of these 3 mechanisms works. In deterrence by proliferation, a country is threatening to possess, but not necessarily use, nuclear weapons at some point in the future in order to gain concessions from an ally or an adversary. And this can be an effective threat to the extent that the target of the threat doesn't want to see that state possess nuclear weapons. The second mechanism, deterrence by delayed attack, does involve the actual use of nuclear weapons or the threatened use of these weapons. And it looks a lot like traditional nuclear deterrence, except that there's a time delay. Because a country making this kind of threat to use nuclear weapons isn't already in possession of the bomb, it would have to race to build one as quickly as possible and then potentially be in a position to use it in retaliation. So there would be some amount of time delay from the moment of making the threat before the threat could be implemented. The third mechanism I call deterrence by doubt, and this happens when a country gets really close to potentially having a nuclear weapon. It might be so close that it's hard for outside observers to know for sure whether it's still non-nuclear or not. You can think, for example, about the case of Iran right now. We know that Iran has been inching closer and closer to a nuclear weapon over the last several months, but we don't know exactly where they are in that process, and there might be a moment in the future where we think they might be so close to a nuclear weapon that we can't rule out the possibility that perhaps they've already assembled one or two. And creating this doubt might be able to give a country leverage or a deterrence posture against its adversaries.
I do want to circle back to Iran before the end of this, but which of those 3 mechanisms do you think might ultimately operate in a situation where we do have a ceasefire on the ground in Ukraine and then there is some sort of long-term negotiated settlement between the 2 parties?
What Ukraine might want to do is to use the prospect of it developing or potentially using nuclear weapons to get a more favorable settlement and bring an end to the war with Russia. So how might it do that? It could use what I've described as deterrence by proliferation if the target is the United States or Britain or France or another country in Europe. And there the idea would be that you're threatening to move forward and potentially arm as a way of pulling these countries into the conflict so that they'll mediate on your behalf and potentially get you a better deal at the bargaining table. That strategy, though, is unlikely to be effective if the target's Russia. If the target's Russia, Ukraine might instead rely on deterrence by delayed attack. It might try to signal to Moscow that if fighting continues, Ukraine might be in a position to potentially obtain a nuclear weapon that perhaps it could use if things were to escalate in the war with Russia. Now, of course, this would be a very risky strategy because merely floating the possibility of nuclear use by Ukraine could be seen as highly escalatory and could result in Russian retaliation. So this is a strategy that is potentially quite effective, but also carries certain risks and the potential for escalation.
Well, now seems like a good time to get to Iran. I want to stay on the topic of latent nuclear capacity, but shift it to that other country. Unlike Ukraine, Iran has uranium enrichment facilities, as you talked about earlier, and they have brought its fuel threshold close to what the weaponization threshold is. There are some preliminary signs that the Trump administration might be taking steps to strike Iran. The most prominent of these was the deployment of bombers to Diego Garcia, which is within the distance that they would need to be able to hit Iran. In addition to that, some speculate that the ongoing strikes against the Houthis are designed to limit Iran's ability to retaliate via proxies. And all of this comes in the shadow of Israel's strikes on Iran months ago, which hit some of the installations that defend Iran's nuclear facilities. And on top of that, Israel fighting a couple of wars on a couple of different fronts, both with Hamas along the western portion of the country and Hezbollah in the northern portion of the country. All of those are also limiting Iranian proxies' abilities to retaliate. So my question to you is, where do you see this going based off of the research that you've done on these topics?
The United States is currently engaged in something we call coercive diplomacy in political science. And that means it's using the possibility of military force against Iran as a way of trying to extract political concessions. In particular, the United States is raising the possibility that it will use military force to destroy Iran's nuclear infrastructure unless Iran comes to the negotiating table and concludes a deal with the United States. President Trump has said that he prefers to resolve this crisis with a deal, but that he's willing to use military force if a deal is not achieved. And we can think about this as a way of trying to get Iran to the negotiating table by making the Iranians think that if they don't come and conclude a deal with the United States, the alternative will be that they'll be attacked militarily. So then the question becomes, is it politically viable for the United States and Iran to conclude a new nuclear deal? And here, let's remember that in 2015, the two countries, along with others, negotiated a deal called the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which limited Iran's nuclear activities in exchange for the lifting of economic sanctions that had been imposed against Iran. But then in 2018, during his first term, President Trump withdrew from this deal. And this creates a lot of suspicion within Iran that any new deal that it would agree to with the United States might at some point in the future be violated or torn up. And this creates some political difficulty for the United States in the present environment. But nonetheless, it's still conceivable that the United States could be able to negotiate a new nuclear deal with Iran. Doing so, I think, depends heavily on allowing Iran to maintain some of its enrichment activities. There's been some discussion that some officials in the Trump administration don't want to allow Iran to have any nuclear enrichment activities whatsoever. Taking a stance like that, in my view, is going to make it very difficult to achieve a deal. But if the United States is open to the possibility that Iran can do some work on enrichment, as long as it doesn't go beyond the level of enrichment that would be needed for its civilian nuclear power plants, which is 3.67%, then there is more room for negotiating leverage in that case. So if there is going to be a new nuclear deal, it would probably be one that resembles the deal that we had in 2015 on certain dimensions, and perhaps with some modifications and improvements. But the United States, for its part, would do well to try and convince the Iranians that Iran's nuclear latency, meaning its enrichment program, could be enough to give the country political leverage, and that Iran doesn't need to go all the way and build nuclear weapons. Because if the United States is able to convince Iran that this is the case, then I think it's much more likely that Iran would come to the table and agree to a new nuclear deal.
Well, very last thought here. Unlike a prospective Ukrainian nuclear weapons program, which would be shrouded in secrecy, we think, as an intelligence community, that we have a fairly good idea about what Iran's facilities look like. Could you speak briefly to where Iran has these facilities, the protections that they have, and how that might affect a type of operation that the United States might undertake to destroy those facilities?
There are several facilities that Iran possesses that the United States or Israel might think about destroying in a potential attack. The two most sensitive are those where Iran has done work on uranium enrichment. And this includes a large-scale enrichment plant at Natanz, which is built out in the open, and its location is well known, and this facility would not be difficult for the US military or the Israeli military to destroy. A second facility, though, is at a military site buried hundreds of feet below a mountain. And this one would be harder to destroy with traditional airstrikes, but not impossible for the United States to do so. The bigger challenge would be if Iran has moved centrifuges or moved materials away from these main sites, because in that case, an attack could be counterproductive because you might use military force to destroy the facilities about which you know. But if there's critical materials or technology at other sites that are unknown, Iran could then, in response, use those materials to arm with nuclear weapons, and the attack would not have had its intended effect. So the United States or Israel or any country who's contemplating a military attack of this nature would need to have high confidence that they know where all the relevant material and technology is located, and that they could destroy it in an attack.
Well, great. Thank you so much for coming on to the show today. The book is Influence Without Arms. Matt, thanks again.
Thanks a lot for having me. I enjoyed the conversation.
And if you enjoyed the conversation, please like, share, and subscribe. And I'll see you next time. Take care.